Ejected during Thursday's Twins-White Sox game in Chicago, Minnesota's Josh Donaldson doubled down on his dirt-kicking activities, stating he deliberately acted in a way to draw a response and ejection from home plate umpire Dan Bellino, with whom Donaldson had an earlier strike zone disagreement. By now, the story is familiar. Of course, Bellino called a strike on a pitch off the plate. Donaldson argued. Manager Baldelli came out to make sure Donaldson didn't get in too much trouble. Then Donaldson hit a home run on the next pitch, and while crossing home plate during his trot, covered home plate with dirt, and then came back for good measure to make sure he got the job done. Bellino threw him out. When asked about his antics, Donaldson told reporters, quote, "I felt great about it," adding that, quote, "the umpire consistently isn't doing their job correctly," singular plural, unless he's using their as a gender-neutral pronoun in the singular tense. "There's no reprimand, no accountability for the guys that are making the decision." Guys, I guess he wasn't using a gender-neutral singular. It's just a plural singular cross-contamination. Stating that someone has to hold them accountable, and the noble Donaldson took it upon himself to do so. That Bellino stood at home plate wanting me to do something, and so I gave it to him. I made a point. Interesting. Notwithstanding our prior reporting on umpire accountability, postseason assignments, CBA performance standards, and the like, this is now Donald's second ejection of the drive-by variety in his career. So that is saying or doing something to the umpire while simultaneously running away from said umpire, dichotomy that is rather telling and indicative of internal conflict manifesting quite naturally through patently unstable exterior behavior. Furthermore, Donaldson's history of ejections, 7 now, feature a cast of young umpires from the same pedigree sharing certain characteristics. For instance, through Trip Gibson, Toby Basner, Chris Conroy, and now Dan Bellino, that's all ball strike ejections, mind you, Donaldson trends toward younger umpires, sometimes the 3 or 4 person on the crew ones, yet Donaldson tends to only dox the AAA umpires, namely Basner and his wife on the social. But of course, Dan Bellino, the lawyer, can't really dox him on the social, can you? He was asking for it at home plate because it's always someone else's fault, but Bellino isn't really Bellino in Donaldson's mind now, is he? Of course not. Bellino, again, he's the lawyer, and Donaldson's overcompensation for ejection contributing to his team's come from a head loss, odd, surely must stem from a miscalculation relative to the caliber of ejector, which, now that I recall, Manager Baldelli complimented Bellino and the remainder of the Hernandez crew after the game, saying, "I'm not worried about that," in response to a question about the umpires, adding that with good umpires such as the Hernandez crew, the game will continue with no incident, and attributing anger and frustration to Donaldson, saying, quote, "he's not sure what to do about it, frankly," as if that isn't the obvious understatement of the century. Which is quite apparent combined with Donaldson's affinity toward the drive-by unsporting act prior mentioned, belies that Donaldson's complicated relationship with authority is well complicated. An affinity for questioning authority without actually putting oneself in a definitive jeopardy, for it is largely easier and less risky to lash out at a person without directly confronting them, suggestive of displacement as opposed to projection we so often see with the Bryce Harpers of the baseball world. By contrast, naturally, Donaldson has gotten himself into multiple fights throughout his major league careers with peer players, and coincidentally, those comprise the only ejections from bona fide crew chief, as it is tradition during the bench clearing fights to attribute them to the crew chief, I suppose. For Donaldson appears keen on displacing unresolved anger issues, possibly childhood, likely father, onto qualified authority figures, that is, the younger, less likely to band about individuals. Donaldson has yet, for instance, to confront a certain Joe West. Too much exposure there, much easier to attack those with equal or marginally higher up, but not too much. The seniority food chain, certainly not within Donald's apparent facade of character, to legitimately challenge a senior member of the staff. So newer umpires with less clout, it is. Potential miscalculation with Bellino, of course, which explains Donaldson's overcompensation in describing his feelings as, quote, great, when internally even Donaldson likely would realize his team actually lost the game. Or perhaps not. Donaldson's so-called righteous attempt at holding umpires to account fails to take into consideration 2 things. First, that his ball strike ejections have been associated with the correct call in a majority of cases, rendering Donaldson's argument of holding umpires to account rather meaningless. And second, that in his ejection by Bellino, Donaldson neglected to recall the importance of his team in a playoff race actually winning a game. What with Chicago actually winning that game instead? They ultimately took the lead on a ground ball to the third base position where Donaldson would have been playing had he not been ejected, allowing Chicago's winning run to score. Again, this is possibly good for Donaldson's personal WAR statistic, but not for Minnesota's win-loss record, a team metric, which I suppose is the point with which Donaldson is arguing to begin with. He lists his contract status in his remarks, again affirming his apparent narcissistic preference for the individual over that of the team attempting to win the game. All for one and one for, well, one. After all, naturally, Donaldson hasn't exactly agreed with team politics for a while now, has he? Chicago, Oakland, Toronto, Cleveland, Atlanta, Minnesota. The penultimate pair resulting in free agency nearing months after ultimate signing, suggesting teamwork isn't exactly his bread and butter now, is it? We'll see what Minnesota does after this season. And of course, lest we forget, Bellino was asking for it, wasn't he? Just as all targets of unmoderated androgenic aggression do, after all. Pity he couldn't have provoked a fight with the opposing catcher instead, but of course not. That would be a veteran player, that opposing catcher. Someone a little out of Donaldson's league given his past preferences, when he is more inclined to punch down at those unlikely to punch back, or if they do, it's a bench-clearing brawl and all bets are off, hence the drive-by nature of the prototypical Donaldson ejection. Thoughts? We'll see you online, closecallsports.com.